Chapter 20, Program Design and Technique for Aerobic Endurance Training. So within this chapter, going to follow very similar to what we saw with program design for resistance training. You really need to pay attention to how much, the amount of intensity your athletes are doing, the duration, and the frequency. Okay, and really looking at the overall volume of training. And so just to know that the longer the workouts are going to be, then intensity has to be lower. There's a relationship just like we saw with resistance training. And that's a lot of times the biggest thing coaches tend to do is that they push their athletes too long, too much, and then for over long periods of time, well, you start to bring about, overtraining symptoms. Okay, so within this, just know that just watch the intensity, watch the duration, and obviously the amount of sessions throughout the week an athlete is partaking in. Okay, there's going to be 5 types of training. Within here, we'll be looking at long, slow distance. You got pace tempo. You got interval. You got high intensity interval, and then fartlek training. And so those are different types of programming that a coach could use going about in terms of, manipulating intensity, manipulating duration, manipulating then also duration as well, or frequency, I'm sorry. So just know that those are different types of training you could use to help out, bring about this training for an athlete or programming, not inducing too much, but keeping things within a realm just enough, push an athlete just enough to where they induce the changes without too much adding on to where they could get injured or to get ill or have some negative occurrences come about. Pay attention to the mode you're working with. Okay, if you have a runner, make sure they run. If you have a cyclist, make sure they cycle. Swimmer, make sure they swim, so forth. And it's kind of the biggest things right there. A lot of times coaches tend to have athletes do more not in line with the sport specific. So they'll have them do a lot of different type of training that really doesn't transfer over to their sport. So just kind of keep that in mind that you got to keep those as close to sport because the greatest transfer of training is going to enhance overall performance. Okay, so just those are some of the main things we'll talk about in here. Just pay attention to those different types of training and how to manipulate up the frequency, duration, and intensity to give the most adaptations while keeping the athlete healthy and safe without any negative consequences coming about. Chapter 20, Program Design and Technique for Aerobic Endurance Training. Within this chapter, we'll be looking at factors that relate to aerobic endurance performance, the mode of aerobic endurance training, aerobic endurance training frequency based on training status, sports season, and recovery requirements, assigning aerobic endurance training duration, understand interaction with training intensity, aerobic endurance exercise intensity, and understand the various methods used to monitor intensity, describing various types of aerobic endurance programs, applying program design variables based on the sport, and addressing cross-training, detraining, tapering, supplemental resistance training when designing an aerobic endurance training program. So as with the last chapter, there's a lot of factors that go into looking at an endurance-based program. Okay, but still some of the similar things you have to worry about with resistance training, same here. And as you don't want to push an athlete to a point where they start to break themselves down. You don't want to push them to the point where they're just doing too much over long periods of time with little rest periods, because eventually you will get into overtraining, eventually get to that point. It gets harder to bring the body back to that same level that it was at before overtraining occurred. Okay, so really be cautious when you're working with endurance athletes about how much volume, which volume's similar here as it was in resistance training. Volume is basically just how much work you're doing. Kind of just like with the resistance training, same thing here. Okay, if you're putting, if you're a runner and you're putting miles and miles and miles throughout the week, consecutively with without any kind of undulation in your training, so going from high to low intensity type days, you're going to impact and cause too much stress on the body and eventually will break down. So just be cautious of all these factors going into designing a program for your endurance athletes. A couple terms or factors. One, you got maximal aerobic capacity. So VO2 max. So duration of aerobic endurance event increases. So does the proportion of total energy that must be met by aerobic metabolism. And so there's a high correlation between VO2 max and performance in aerobic endurance events. Safe bet, those who have a higher VO2 max tend to be better athletes endurance-wise. So if you were a betting person and you want to bet on who would win a race, well, go someone with the highest VO2 max. However, it's not always the case. So, I mean, it's a safe bet to go with that, but I know, if I'm not mistaken, the man who beat the 2-hour marathon, Kajobi, I believe his name is, he had a VO2 max somewhere in the 80s. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but that's not the highest VO2 max ever recorded. And to my understanding, I think there were some other runners that when they're trying to figure out which one they wanted, the project who wanted to beat the 2-hour marathon, they had other runners who had a higher VO2 than Kajobi. However, they chose Kajobi because there's a lot more factors that go into performance aerobically than just VO2. It's a huge component, but there's other factors that go in as well. But nonetheless, just know, the better the VO2 max, the better your performance will generally be in endurance events. Then you have lactate threshold. So it says the speed of a movement or the percentage of VO2 max at which a specific blood lactate concentration observed, or the point at which blood lactate concentration begins to increase above resting levels. So the threshold is that point where the body becomes solely anaerobic. Just think back to metabolism and remember where lactate comes from and why it's produced. It's produced because glycolysis is working at too fast of a rate than the oxidative system can handle. So lactate threshold is a point at which you'll see lactate kind of starting to increase, with intensity and duration. You start seeing it kind of going up at a slow pace, but then eventually you're going to hit a spot where it's going to then skyrocket up. That's where you become, like I said, solely anaerobic at that point. Okay, with that being said, they say some studies have shown that athletes' lactate threshold appears to be a better indicator of his or her aerobic endurance performance than VO2 max. Okay, this goes back to what I was just saying earlier. There's a lot more that goes into aerobic performance than just how high your VO2 max is. Okay, and so when you're looking at these factors, the way you can handle some of these byproducts being produced basically the system's handling all these factors going on at once better, as opposed to just looking at just like, well, how much oxygen can you consume? Because remember, VO2 max is looking at metabolic and cardiovascular, how well your metabolic and cardiovascular system can handle a given workload. And so a lot of times that metabolic aspect is really important because you are producing lactate before you are consuming oxygen, if you think about a metabolic chain and metabolic pathway. So that's why they say lactate threshold is a better indicator, because if you can handle these byproducts a lot better, then you could keep pushing yourself at that given workload for a longer period of time. But nonetheless, all this is encompassing to when it goes into performance, you have to look at all these factors coming in at once. Then you have exercise economy. So it's a measure of the energy cost of activity at a given exercise velocity. So basically, kind of similar to what we've been talking about, is like, well, how well can you handle, or how much energy is being expended by doing a certain activity? And so those who have better performance have a lot lower energy cost, or they expend less energy, I should say, than those who are like a trained versus untrained will do that. Basically, the economy is just a lot better. That means they're preserving primarily glycogen a lot better than those who are untrained. So it's just the cost isn't as strong or as stressful on a trained person versus untrained person. And of course, improvement in exercise economy can enhance maximum aerobic power and lactate threshold. Okay, so all these factors that go into aerobic performance. So in designing a program, one, what is the mode? Mode is going to be cycling, running, swimming, cross-country, skiing. I mean, any of these things would be considered the mode. And when designing the mode, it says the more specific the training mode is to the sport, the greater the improvement in performance. This is getting kind of specificity of training. So if you want to improve in a sport, then you should be training that way as much as possible. Okay, if you're a cyclist training for the Tour de France, you should be cycling. Okay, if you're a runner, you should be running. If you're a swimmer, you should be swimming. Okay, and of course, if you're a triathlete, you should be doing all the above, all three of them, because that's what composes a triathlon. So just remember, when you're looking at the mode for designing a program, keep it as specific as possible. Okay, if you're a cyclist, there's no point really having your athletes going out and running. That's just a lot of wear and tear that's not needed for the sport. Okay. And then you have frequency. It says number of training sessions conducted per day, per week. Just like we talked about in resistance training, same thing here. It's sessions, not days. A lot of times we go days, but when you get to training athletes and more elite they become, it becomes more sessions because you might have, 2-a-days type deal. Of course, it will depend on the intensity and duration, the training status, and the specific sports season. This specific sports season, again, is going to be preseason, off-season, in-season, just like we talked about. And there's a slide coming up at the end of these that will show that as well. And just know with frequency, this is where you get into overtraining. The more sessions you have, you got to be careful if you're incorporating more sessions, not to have the intensity or duration upped as well. Okay. The harder you work, the less duration they need to be, and probably the less sessions as well. Okay, so this is up to the coach, the strength and conditioning professional, to be able to know how to manipulate all three of these variables. That is frequency, intensity, and duration. How you manipulate them to where you keep making progress, keep making gains, but not putting too much wear and tear on the athlete. Especially for aerobic training, there's just a lot of stress placed on the systems. And I say systems being, the neuromuscular, the joints, cardiovascular, all your soft tissues, ligaments, all that. There's a lot of stress over time put on the body. So you need to know how to manipulate all three so you keep as healthy as possible while still making progressive gains. Okay, intensity says adaptations in the body are specific to the intensity of the training session. High intensity aerobic exercise increases cardiovascular and respiratory function and allows for improved oxygen delivery to the working muscles. Increase in exercise intensity may also benefit skeletal muscle adaptations by affecting muscle fiber recruitment. Okay, so more or less, if you want to get the best adaptations, you need to train at a higher intensity. And we're not saying like 90% of VO2 max high, but you need to be training at a sufficient enough intensity to start inducing these adaptations. And really, the harder you work, the better the adaptations are going to be. And it says adaptations affecting muscle fiber recruitment. You will start to develop with a lot more aerobic training, coupled with some resistance training. A lot of times, you're not going to become solely type 1, but you'll start getting more type 1 development, but you also get a lot of type 2 as well. Type 2 fibers are beneficial because, or I should say type 2A. I should have clarified that because there's two, type 2X and type 2A. Remember back to our muscles. Well, your type 2A have a lot more mitochondria, a lot more enzymes, a lot more fatigue resistant. So you will start to have a lot of adaptations to your type 2A, as well as then also more the type 1 as well. All those are more beneficial in terms of aerobic endurance training. The best way to monitor intensity is heart rate. It says the most frequently used methods prescribing aerobic exercise intensity. Heart rate basically reflects the intensity at which you're working. So that's always the best method to be looking at for in terms of intensity. So to calculate heart rate, there's a couple formulas I'm sure you've all heard before. But you can see over on the table VO2 max and HRR, so your heart rate reserve. And then MHR, so that's maximum heart rate. You can see that pretty much correlate over pretty close to your VO2 max. Well, your heart rate reserve directly reflects VO2 max, and then percent of your maximal heart rate. It's a little bit higher than your VO2 max, but it's still, pretty close. But nonetheless, when you're looking at knowing where to train, those are two different ways to be able to come upon that. And so you get those by going, well, one, you get the heart rate reserve, or for the Carvona method. So you've defined that. This is getting into then where you get heart rate reserve. So you go to 20 minus age, which is then going to give your age predicted maximal heart rate. You're going to subtract your resting heart rate, and then you're going to that will give us your heart rate reserve. But then if you want to get really close to a training target heart rate, then you would say take your training heart rate, and that's going to equal your heart rate reserve multiplied by the intensity you want to work at plus your resting heart rate. Make sure it says do this calculation twice to determine target heart rate range. Okay, because you can see right there that the heart rate reserve is not. It's basically just taking your age predicted, minusing your resting heart rate, and so, well, you just take your age predicted. Minus your resting heart rate, that'll give you heart rate reserve. But then you want to be more specific. You got to get to the intensity part. So there's where you get the target heart rate, the range you want to train at. So that's for that. Or you could go at the bottom, you can see down there, percent of maximal heart rate method, 220 minus age will give you then your target heart rate. Or to get that, you take that by intensity, and that's kind of where you get at. So to be a little bit more specific, the Carvona method is going to be a little bit more specific in terms of training, because what happens is with just taking the percent of maximal heart rate, that doesn't take into account the resting heart rate aspect. And so when you're taking 220 minus your age and just times it by intensity, well, you could have two athletes at the same age, so the same age predicted maximal heart rate, but one is more trained than the other, and one thing we know with training becomes a lower resting heart rate. So the Carvona method is going to be a lot more specific to the individual, as opposed to just taking the percent of your age predicted max heart rate and intensity. And so the Carvona method is where you go 220 minus your age. Once again, that gives you your age predicted. You subtract resting heart rate, and then you times that by your target heart rate by intensity, plus add in back the resting heart rate, and that gives you that exact, that very specific heart rate range to be training at for that individual. And that's the preferred method, more or less, is for the Carvona method. You can also, if you don't have heart rate, you could do, to get intensity, this is a modified rating perceived exertion scale. The true one by Borg is a 6 to 20 scale. This one's a somewhat more modified, a little bit easier to understand because it's just a 1 to 10 scale. But this is something to where you could ask your athletes on scale 1 to 10, 1 being watching TV laying down, 10 being chased from a bear, can't go any harder kind of deal. It's a little bit easier to understand as opposed to the 6 to 20 scale, because a 6 to 20, unless you have the sheet in front of you or tells you exactly the different stages, it's hard to kind of pinpoint where you're at on that one. So the 1 to 10 scale is a lot easier for athletes. It's a lot quicker. Like someone's working out, like, hey, how do you feel right now? Scale 1 to 10, where you at? So that's one way to measure intensity. You can also do METs, so metabolic equivalents. And it says 1 MET is equal to 3.5 mLs per kg per minute of oxygen consumption is considered the amount of oxygen required by the body at rest. So METs are just looking at, we'll see the next, it's in the book. I didn't put that in here. And the book has a listing of a bunch of different exercises, bunch of different movements, kind of equating what METs they are. METs are just looking at essentially if something you're doing is 6 METs, then that would be 6 times the amount of oxygen consumption than rest. So 1 MET is 3.5 mLs per kg per minute. So then 6 METs would be 6 times that. So that's how you get how they've arranged different exercises, different movements in terms of the oxygen consumption for those. Another way of saying more oxygen being consumed, you're working harder, a lot higher intensity. Lastly, for intensity, do power measurement. And you could look at cranking power, like on a cycloergometer. That'll tell you essentially how hard you're working. And then it says metabolic rate is closely related to mechanical power production. So if there's a lot more power production coming from the cycle, you get, as you're testing via the cranking of the legs, then you could go like, well, we know there's probably a higher metabolic rate, therefore a higher intensity. And then duration. It says duration is the length of time a training session. As you know what duration is, but just the key term, you see the bottom, is influenced by the intensity. That is, the longer the duration, the lower the exercise intensity and vice versa. So just be conscious of that with athletes, you can't have them doing super long workout at a super high intensity. One, they probably can't get through it, but if they somehow do, it's just a lot of wear and tear in the body that's not going to actually induce desirable benefits or adaptations. So look at progression. It says progression of an aerobic endurance program involves increasing the frequency, intensity, and duration. It says should not increase by more than 10% each week. When it's not feasible to increase frequency or duration, progression can occur with intensity manipulation. And once again, I've been saying this should be monitored to prevent overtraining. And here's the 5 different training types. We're going to go through each one of those. So you got long, slow, distance, pace, tempo, interval, high intensity interval, and then fartlek. And you see the duration down there, the work bout portion, and then correlated over then with the intensity. So you can see like long, slow distance, only a couple times per week, 30 to 120 minutes of duration at about 70% of VO2 max. Contrast that with high intensity interval training, 30 to 90 seconds for work. And you want to work to rest ratio 1 to 5 is what they recommend. But then with intensity greater than VO2 max. So you can see the relationship between duration and intensity. The longer you go, the lower the intensity, or vice versa. So long, slow distance training. As we said, 30 minutes to 2 hours. So this is just training distance greater than race distance. Intensity is equivalent to about 70% of VO2 max. Your adaptations will be ability to clear lactate a lot better, as well as eventual shift of type 2X fibers to type 1 fibers. That is, as I said earlier, becoming more type 2A. Because remember, fiber type switching, you go 2X to 2A to 1, or 1, 2A, 2X. So the eventual shift, you start becoming more type. If you have a lot of type 2X fibers, they're going to probably become a lot more type 2A. And then you might have some switching then the 2A to 1. Okay, so just remember the jumping of shifts of fibers. The more work you do, the more you'll become 2A and more type 1. So one disadvantage of this is intensity is lower than that of competition. So it says this is advantage because too much long, slow duration is being used. So what I mean by that is let me say it over again. The disadvantage to long, slow distance training is that the intensity is too low compared to competition. So going back to what we talked about earlier, you'll get greater adaptations by training at a higher intensity. The harder you work, the more adaptations will come about. So if you do a lot of long, slow distance training, well, you don't want to do too much of that through programming over a long period of time because you're not training at that sufficient intensity. So, but the benefit of doing long, slow distance is you will get a lot of adaptations. You'll get benefits in terms of, you get some capillarization, you get the blood flow, you will have mitochondria shifts. You will have some of those coming about. And so what you really want to do is this is a good thing to throw into a programming, a couple times just to basically switch up the training days. Okay. And sometimes you can almost use this, even though it's a lower intensity, you're still going to get the benefits, but it might be a good recovery tool. You might be going a little bit longer distance, but the lower intensity might help out with recovery a little bit as well. Okay. So don't steer away from doing long, slow distance training in the programming, but don't rely upon this too much. And the flip could be said about, high intensity interval training. Yeah, you're going at a super high intensity, but the durations are not going to be the same as they are during competition. So it's how you manipulate all these together to get the greatest amount of changes and most adaptations as possible. You got pace or tempo training. It says intensity at or slightly above competition, corresponding to the lactate threshold. So this is 20 to 30 minutes of continuous training at a lactate threshold. So right at that point where, where the threshold starts to spike, you become slowly anaerobic. You're kind of training right at that point right there. And the goal is to try and push the lactate threshold to the right as much as possible. So that's the steady pace tempo. Then you got intermittent pace tempo. So series of shorter intervals with brief recovery periods. So the objectives: develop a sense of race pace, enhance the body's ability to sustain exercise at that pace, improve running economy, increase lactate threshold. Because that's one of the things that gets difficult during competition. You can't really mimic in training, is the psychological aspect of being in a race. That is knowing how to pace yourself, knowing how to keep going at a certain intensity, dealing with the stress of competition, and then you got see people that you're running against, you're trying to win, all that. So doing pace tempo training is good because one, it gets you kind of gets the athlete knowing how to control themselves, because really a lot of times in races, it's not to the very end where you give it all you can to get across the finish line. And so this helps athletes to kind of know how to push themselves at that point to where they could keep going. That is right at that lactate threshold. And this will help push the lactate threshold to the right a little bit. But also, this is helping them to control the psychological aspect of knowing, like, all right, I'm at this pace. I'm doing well. I'm making good time. And it helps them to build up for then competition. So that's why a lot of coaches will implement a lot of this into their training, is to kind of help them to get an idea of timing, how long they're going, and at what intensity they're doing all that. You got interval training. So this is at intensity close to VO2 max for intervals of 3 to 5 minutes. Work ratio should be 1-to-1. That is, if you work for 3 minutes, rest for 3 minutes. And then this allows athletes to train at intensities close to their VO2 max for a greater amount of time. This will then help out increase VO2 max and enhance aerobic metabolism. So it should be used sparingly and only when training athletes with a firm aerobic endurance training base. So kind of like you're seeing with all these different types of training that there's not one that's better than necessarily the other. They all have their advantages. They all have their disadvantages. but it's good to implement them all because you're trying to hit all points of the overall aerobic system, I guess you could say. That is long, slow. You get them, training for a long period of time. Might help out with recovery. You'll have some of the fiber type switching, something like that. But then you have the pace tempo, which you're not training at super high intensity, but you're kind of at the intensity that you would be competing at. You have interval training, which gets you way on and beyond what you actually need. But then this will help out, enhance, like it says, if this will enhance your aerobic metabolism, that means then, going back to the last slide, this will help you with lactate threshold. This will help you push if you're training at that point where you become anaerobic, and you're training with this high amount of byproducts being produced continuously, then the system will start to learn how to control those metabolic byproducts. So this will help out maintain that lactate threshold, like I said, pushing it to the right, which means allowing you to keep training at or competing or working at a certain intensity without being overwhelmed. Then you have high intensity interval training. It says high intensity bouts interspersed with brief recovery periods. It says need to spend several minutes above 90% of VO2 max for an optimal stimulus. It says this may be effective in improving running economy and running speed. This is an example for a long interval hit is greater than 2 to 3 minutes at 90% of VO2 max with relief bouts of less than 2 minutes. So anyways, this is kind of going with interval training. This is just pushing a little bit further, way almost at your VO2 max at that point. But nonetheless, I've already kind of said it already, so I'm not going to go back through again. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. Using them wisely will help an athlete develop across a whole spectrum throughout all of anaerobic and aerobic metabolism. And the last one's fartlek. Fartlek comes from the Swedish word for speed. And so this combines other methods of training. So easy running says a 70% VO2 max, combined with hills or short, fast bursts of almost near max, so 85 to 90% VO2 max. And this can be adopted for cycling and swimming as well. But the benefits are you'll enhance the VO2 max, increase lactate threshold, and improve running economy and fuel utilization. Key points. Various types of training induce different physiological responses. A sound program should incorporate all types of training in athletes' weekly, monthly, and yearly training schedule. As I was saying, use all 5 of those. If you use them wisely, correctly throughout a training session, when I say training session, I mean through a training block, I should say. Like it says right down there, weekly, monthly, yearly training schedule. Then you'll start to hit the whole spectrum throughout anaerobic and aerobic metabolism factors. Each one has its advantage, each one has its disadvantage, but collectively, you really do get a sound, well-rounded training program that will, like I said, will hit all aspects of the athlete needed to perform at a certain level. Here's our training seasons. You have off-season. This is the base training. This is where you begin. It says long duration, low intensity, gradually increase intensity, and to a lesser extent, duration. This is where you, like I said, do a lot of that long, slow. And that's really the long, slow is really just building up an aerobic base. Okay, that's where you're just building up the foundation, getting a sturdy platform, just something to be able to build upon throughout the rest of the training block, throughout the rest of the seasons. And you got preseason. This is focused on increasing intensity, maintaining or reducing duration, and incorporating all types of training. You got in season, so this would be competition. Program should be designed around competition with low intensity and short duration training just before race days. You got postseason, active rest, focus on recovering from competitive season while maintaining sufficient fitness. So that postseason, in a lot of ways, you could do a lot of long duration, long slow activities. So that's not postseason. A lot of times in the off season, the beginning off season kind of really blurred together a little bit right there, because you never want to just take a lot of time off. Because even with 1 week of no training at all, you could lose about 50% of your metabolic factors and about 25% of your heart size just within 1 week of no training whatsoever. And so you got to be careful. You want to take too much time off after a season. Even if you just got out and just did something, it'll help you maintain until you get ready for your next off-season training block. It says a sound year-round aerobic endurance training program should be divided into sport seasons with specific goals and objectives designed to improve performance gradually and progressively. Keyword goals in there. Make sure you, as you're training athletes to building up these programs, you have a goal for each one of the seasons. And all of them, you should be making gradual, progressive performance increases with as little injuries as much as possible. Okay, a couple last little points here. It says cross-training. So a mode of training that can be used to maintain general conditioning in athletes during periods of reduced training due to injury or during recovery from a training cycle. And cross-training could be, you see a lot of that everywhere. Think of CrossFit and things like that. You're doing resistance training with high-intensity interval training of some kind or something along those lines. You're mixing it all together. And you got to be careful, though, when it says, during times of reduced training due to injury or recover from a training cycle. Well, you don't want to be doing a lot of, high cross-training type activity like squatting and sprinting and all that stuff when you're injured. During this time, it's something where if you have an endurance athlete who's injured, you could have them maybe do a little bit more time in the weight room, do a lot more lifting. Or, if you have someone who's a runner who needs to recover, doing some lifting and high, bouts on a cycle, because cycling is low impact compared to running. So that's what we're talking about. Cross training is kind of using different modes, kind of combined to kind of help out during either a recovery period or just branching into a new training cycle. Okay, then you got detraining. It says when the athlete reduces the training duration or intensity or stops training altogether due to a break in training program, injury, or illness. It says in the absence of an appropriate training stimulus, the athlete experiences a loss of the physiological adaptations brought about by training. That's what I just said earlier. You can see when you stop training completely within 1 week, 50% decrease in metabolic factors, 25% decrease in heart size. So you never want to stop training altogether. The best thing to do is if you're getting ready for competition and getting ready to go into another cycle, tapering would be the better method. It says tapering, says a systematic reduction of training duration and intensity combined with an increased emphasis on technique, work, and nutritional intervention. The object of tapering the training regimen is to attain peak performance at the time of competition. So tapering is where you really plan out, and a lot of times you see it's like for running for a race, you'll see, they'll a week before a competition, a racer will do their last long race. I think for marathons, I've never done one, but what I've heard is about a week or so before the marathon, runners will go out and do their last long race, which I think is, for marathons, 26.2 miles. I think somewhere around an 18-mile run is where somewhere around there, not exactly sure, but they'll go out and do, a week before the marathon, they'll go out and do that one last long race or long running session. And then that next week leading into the competition, they'll still run, but they'll cut down the miles big time. They'll start to cut them down throughout the week leading up to the competition. So they're still training. There's just not training at the same duration or intensity. But they're still training, and it says focus on technique, nutrition, hydration, all these factors, sleeping, all that leading up to the day of competition. So you're better off, and even if you're not getting ready for a race, you're better off. Let's say you're getting tired, you're an athlete and you just need a break. Don't take a week off. You're better off to just take a week, cut down intensity duration as much as possible, and still do something, but just cut back as much, cut back a lot. That'll help you recover and get you set up to get back to training again. Even if you, for a week, you need a break, just go and just do, 2 sessions in the week is all. That'll help maintain what's been built up, give you the rest needed to get you back. You just never want to stop training at all. Detraining is the last thing you ever want to do as an athlete, especially endurance athletes. So resistance training, when looking at endurance training, so limited research, but data does suggest that benefits can be derived from performing resistance training during aerobic endurance training. You'll get some improvements in short-term exercise performance, faster recovery from injuries, and the prevention of overuse injuries and reduction of muscle imbalances. It can improve hill climbing, bridging gaps between competitors during breakaways, and the final sprint. In a lot of ways, resistance training, though, too, we forget that we're just not training the muscles of resistance training. We're training up our bone, the bone mineral density. We're adding to that. So we're training our bones, our skeletal system. We're training our soft tissues, so ligaments, tendons, all the connective tissue. And so resistance training should be incorporated into an endurance training program, but it shouldn't be the sole focus. Maybe 2 days a week of body weight type exercises, and some, you don't want to stay away completely from squats, but you don't have to be squatting heavy. Just something to where you are training the muscles to some extent, because you'll get a lot of those benefits when it comes then to the race. And the better the joints can handle the stress, the less likely injuries will occur. So make sure to get some resistance training in with endurance programming. And altitude, says the height above sea level ranging from 500 meters to 5,500 meters. So, and it says acclimatization may occur between 12 and 14 days at moderate altitudes up to 2,300 meters, but could take up to several months. In order to see an ergogenic effect, athletes need a hypoxic dose greater than 12 hours per day for a minimum of 3 weeks at a moderate altitude. And so when it comes to altitude, your endurance is here's the hard part with endurance. When you go to altitude, it's going to be affected. Okay, the best thing to do is if you are going to compete at a certain altitude higher than sea level, you see it takes 12 to 14 days at moderate altitudes up to 2,300 meters. So 2,300 meters is really not that high up. And so for those who've had ex-phys should know that when it comes to altitude, everything goes down. VO2 max goes down. Your cardiac output, especially plasma volume, stroke volume goes down. Heart rate, resting heart rate goes up. Training heart rate goes up. So all these factors, that basically you just can't train the same intensity altitudes you can at lower levels. But if you are competing at altitude, you're best to get to that area, a couple weeks before, to start to get somewhat acclimated to the altitude as much as possible. And moderate altitudes up to 2,300 meters, that's only about 6,500 feet. So 6,500 feet. And so you think 5,500, well, that's basically double that, which there's not many people competing at 14,000 feet. That's about 14,000 thereabouts, a little more actually. And so just know when you get to altitude, the higher up you go, the worse it's going to be. But why do people actually want to go up there? Because the misnotion that training altitude will give you some kind of performance benefit, and it doesn't. Okay. So just keep that in mind. And then it says to get some kind of ergogenic effect. So you will see in a hypoxic, those who have like hypoxic chambers, altitude chambers they sleep in, they do give you some benefits. So the benefit of altitude you do get is you do get increase in red blood cell production, which will help out endurance wise, but you need to spend a certain amount of time in them. That's why they sleep in those altitude chambers overnight. But it says to have some kind of effect, you need to have 12 hours a day for a minimum of 3 weeks at moderate altitude. So that moderate altitude you can see is really about, that 2,300 meters is about 7,000 feet. So to really get some kind of, you really got to put a lot of time into it, and you really don't get that much improvements. You get some red blood cell increases, but that's about it. Other than that, though, overall performance will go down solely based because you can't train at the same intensity. You can't work at the same intensity at altitudes you can at lower elevations. Okay, as you can see from this chapter, we discussed a number of different training. We talked about long, slow, pace, tempo, interval, high intensity interval, fartlek training. So we talked about the different types of programming, how to, with all those right there, you're manipulating intensity, manipulating duration and frequency. So when it comes to the best aerobic performance, the best thing is that you want to have, well, VO2, when you're looking at aerobic endurance, you're looking at VO2 is one of the best predictors. Now, it's not necessarily the best one all the time because there's other factors that go into aerobic performance than just solely how high VO2. But it's a safe bet that the higher your VO2, the better you perform, the better you are in your event. But VO2 is looking at how well the metabolic and cardiovascular systems can handle a given workload. And so knowing the different training programming is a way to manipulate both the cardiovascular aspect as well as the metabolic aspects. Some trainings you're really focusing on the cardiovascular, like the long, slow, and you're getting some of the metabolic, but the long, slow, you're not really pushing that point where you get into the lactate threshold. You're really focused on that cardiovascular adaptations at that point and getting some metabolic as well. But then you do the high intensities, you're really then focusing on having, training at that lactate threshold. Trying to move that to, well, for you, it'd be moving it like that to, if you're looking at me, towards the right is where you want to go. Move that to the right as much as possible. So if you're training, I'm sorry, I don't know if that really worked or not right there. Just know that you want to move the graph to the right. If you're looking at the graph, move it to the right. It's a little backwards on the camera. I apologize for that. But by doing so, by training close to that point where you become anaerobic, become solely that lactate threshold, well, you can handle those metabolic products a lot more, which allows you to keep training at that same level for a longer period of time. So that's why the high intensity type training is good, because it helps you focus on that. Okay, but if you looked at that graph, that table, and it's table 20.4 to be exact, it really shows you, how many times per week you should do this, how long, and the intensity. And really knowing how to manipulate all those up to get the best changes, the best adaptations, to allow the athlete to compete and train at a given workload that allows the most adaptations to come about without injuring or bring about some negative consequences. Okay, so when it comes to programming, just remember those key points, the different types of training, and just kind of know how to manipulate up those variables to bring about the best adaptations while keeping the athletes healthy and injury-free.